Africa. That's the label that would transform the continent. Today, 80% of Africa's exports are primary goods. Many of those are minerals that the world desperately needs, like lithium that powers electric car batteries, or much-loved commodities like cocoa, coffee, or vanilla beans. But it's the manufacturing of those products where real wealth is created, and that's where Africa has lost out. But governments are starting to say, you want our natural resources? Then come make it here. Hello, I'm Carol Pino. Welcome to our show, Africa USA Now, current events at the intersection of Africa and the United States. Our program is presented by the World Trade Center, Washington, D.C., and supported by the African Development Bank and the Africa Investment Forum. Africa is the wealthiest continent on Earth. Name almost any resource, and Africa has it, sometimes with enough to dominate the market. But for decades, experts have said the key to Africa's growth is value addition, taking cocoa and producing it into chocolate bars, logs into lumber and furniture, diamonds into cut and polished gems. For manufactured products, 90% of the revenue and job creation comes from adding value to primary goods. Africa's governments have done everything they can to encourage investment up the value chain, from promotional campaigns to roadshows spanning the globe. But progress is frustratingly slow. More than two-thirds of U.S. foreign direct investment into Africa is still for primary goods. But some African governments are forcing the issue through taxes or banning the exportation of raw goods to demand their fair share of value addition. And they're thinking big. Here's Akinwumi Adesina, president of the African Development Bank, at the recent Africa Investment Forum.
The future of electric cars in the world depends on Africa, but we're not going to make the same mistakes again of exporting raw materials. No. We want to develop value chains to manufacture lithium-ion batteries for electric cars, and why not electric cars right here in Africa?
Here to unpack all this are three amazing guests. Mthuli Ncube, Minister of Finance in Zimbabwe, Yofi Grant, CEO of the Ghana Investment Promotion Center, and Mima Nedeljkovic, Chairman of Africa Global Schaefer. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So let's start with Zimbabwe, where Minister Ncube, you recently banned the exportation of raw lithium. Tell us about it.
Well, what motivated Zimbabwe to ban the importation of unprocessed lithium is really the need to create more jobs, drive more investment into the sector, and also just improve the quality of growth. It's easy for countries to grow out of exporting raw commodities, but growth is more durable if it's processed product, apart from just diversifying the economy. We want to create more jobs, and the one way to do it is if we can invest in lithium processing, plants and facilities, at least to get it to concentrate level, and then future, we can invest in lithium battery manufacturing. We've seen investors saying, hey, we welcome this, we see opportunity in this. They want to partner government in the manufacture of lithium batteries. They've gone all the way to lithium batteries.
This is obviously the minerals of the future, right? Because of renewable energy and storage batteries, energy batteries, car batteries, the all EV, environment. So it really is a mineral of the future, and we feel that we ought to maximize value from this finite resource. Currently, globally, we're ranked at number 5 in terms of number 5 producer in the world. The other countries are ahead of us, but we have a lot more because Zimbabwe is underexplored. Actually, I believe we've got a lot more lithium than we are currently purported to be having, because we just need to do more exploration. So it's a critical mineral. We have a factory already. Locally, it's been around for more than 40 years. So there's already some nascent, capability in the overall battery industry.
And Yofi, a lot is happening in Ghana as well. In fact, your president recently said some things that were rather surprising to the Swiss.
And we are actually working hard to ensure that we add value to our resources. Cocoa, for which we are known to be the number 2 producer in the world, we have sounded note that in the near future, we would cut the cocoa beans that we actually export and process them internally into chocolate, into liquor, all those things. If you look at it, from every bar of chocolate that is sold, the farmer earns less than 5%. Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire produce 67% of the world's cocoa beans. But arguably, it's at $6 billion, $7 billion dollar economy every year. But if you look at the chocolate economy alone, over 120 billion a year. Where should we be? We obviously should be at the higher end of the value chain. And I think that is the wake-up call that a lot of Africa is sounding and rattling about. That we're rattling the saber and saying that, you know what, we do agree that resources are required for global growth, but the resources are here. If we need to create a better future for our young people, we need to add value and move further up the value chain. The continent is very rich, but it hasn't really resulted in the continent's turnaround over the past 30 to almost 60 years. And Africa's people are still poor. And as a date, we are exporting our raw materials and importing finished goods made from those materials. And Ghana has made it very clear that that is not the narrative that we want to create for the future. Through with a new initiative called the Ghana Beyond Aid, where we want to go beyond getting aid and handouts from rich nations to develop our continents, but we would rather participate in partnerships for linkages and trade, and use our own resources and our own initiatives to develop our continent. Over 850 million of the population of the continent are young people below the age of 35. And we need to create a vibrant, enterprising, and potentially wealthy future for them. And if exporting our raw materials does not help, then we need to add value in situ, which will create more higher value jobs, higher paying jobs, but also create opportunity for our young people to participate in the global economy. We also have set in some policies like the One District, One Factory, which will be the foundations of an industrial economy, moving away from the export of raw materials and resources and adding value. So we have put a new foundation and a new architecture to transform the economy into a better, modernized economy than was there before.
Well, and it's really incredible with the cocoa because everybody loves chocolate. And it's really just two countries that are providing 70%. So if anyone should be able to get added value from it, it's Ghana. Nema, you do business with countries all over Africa. And, you know, these are two examples that we've just heard from Zimbabwe with lithium and Ghana with cocoa. What rumblings are you hearing from governments about legislating added value, enforcing this issue?
So I would argue to my government brothers here that the real important thing is not only legislating, which is absolutely critical, but it's also enabling the private sector, whether it's the foreign private sector or the domestic private sector, to be able to produce, give and add value on a competitive basis. I mean, let's face it, in the end, we're one market. The world is one market. Ghana's not competing against Cote d'Ivoire or Nigeria. They're competing against the world. They're competing against Switzerland for the chocolate. So the key now becomes a combination of that legislation. You will add value. You like my cocoa. You want my cocoa? Well, guess what? You're going to have to do some value addition. I always say that if China had nearly 70% of the cocoa, I doubt very much chocolate would be made anywhere else in the world but China. Now, for me as a business person, as an investor, to do value addition, also have to be competitive. Otherwise, I'm going to go with that other 33% of cocoa, wherever it comes from, and produce it there. So that's, I think, a very important point. Let me come back to the minerals issue. We are not going to go to renewable power without the minerals on the African continent. And if the African political leadership is correct as is doing, saying, fine, you want my minerals, well, then I want some value addition to the minerals here. The key then becomes, how do we do it? We need power. We come back to the power issue. Guinea is one of the world's largest bauxite producers, and not the largest bauxite producers. Guinea was also the very last country in the world, after Indonesia banned raw bauxite from being exported, to still allow raw bauxite. And then you got into a chicken game discussion between government and the miners. All the miners wanted to do was export the basic rock. And government said, you know what? You're not going to basically export just rock. I need process. I need processing in country. The miners then come back and said, but we can't process without power. We then said, okay, let's solve the problem. 2 gigawatts of power to be developed in country, specifically for the mining industry. But let's get real here, and let's get to not potential, but actually delivering value, delivering product, delivering value, getting into the value chains. And that is really what that legislation is, a very critical element.
You're right. So it's not just about legislation. It's important for us to have adequate power to power this new initiative, to power this new vision. It's important to put in place incentives then for the private sector to invest in the beneficiation, but also government should make an effort to have skin in the game and put its own resources as well online here so that we can then move faster after the ban to turn things around.
Let's take a look back to understand how this reliance on primary goods came about. Africa's colonial history was all about resource extraction and others benefiting from Africa's natural wealth. With independence, Africans controlled their resources, and governments could sell concessions or collect taxes on extracting those goods. But that's only part of the story. Colonialism may have ended, but the post-colonial powers in industrialized nations continued to hold tremendous sway, often with the focus remaining on extraction and on securing markets for selling manufactured goods back to Africa. Africa may have gained political independence in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, but its economic independence is far more recent, and in many countries, it's a battle still being fought. Professor Ncube, you're a minister now, but we all still love to call you Professor Ncube. So as the former chief economist of the African Development Bank, explain to us how we got into this situation.
No, frankly, the original economic relationship between colon and colonizer was an extractive relationship. Those are the facts. So you find that in most countries, the colonizer would have focused on just extracting the resource and not in investing in beneficiation. In some countries, it was different. Then a manufacturing base, was put in place. But in the main, the relationship was very extractive. But so this has to change. I mean, this has continued for a while because also there's a shortage of, the right numbers of entrepreneurs in Africa. Also, you need entrepreneurs who are willing to take risk and big risk. You've seen it in, here I'm going to mention another country since you asked me about the Africa, which is Nigeria. If you look at what one of the best entrepreneurs, Ms. Aliko Dangote, has done, he really gone out and invested big time in key industries in Nigeria. Those are the type of entrepreneurs that we need all over Africa, in all our countries, frankly, who can take big risk and put quite a lot of stakes. So that also needs to be nurtured, needs to be supported. We as government also need to support local entrepreneurs for them to grow and learn to take a bigger risk, but then supplement that with some of the policies that we've taken supporting our entrepreneurs or indeed attracting foreign direct investment. This is the only way we're going to increase intra-Africa trade. Here we're talking about in Africa, sort of free continental trade area. We need stuff to trade. It can't be minerals. It may be a bit of wood, but there's not minerals, and that's going outside Africa. So we need some manufactured products, some beneficiated products to trade among ourselves and increase intra-Africa trade and catch up with Asia or indeed the rest of the world. Other countries like China are beneficiating. I mean, we're buying lithium batteries from China right now, frankly, and Africa ought to learn, that we've got the resource here, and let's invest in power, make sure there's enough energy, and let's attract the partners who will work with us to beneficiate and support skill development, and let's make money out of this.
Absolutely. I was just reading something recently of the U.S. in the 1800s. We had at that point the same, if you will, colonial relationship with Britain as Zimbabwe had. And U.S. was producing cotton. It was being shipped to Manchester, was being transformed into clothing and shipped back to the U.S. Actually, legislation was put in by the U.S. Congress, specifically not allowing raw cotton to go out. And that then created a whole cotton industry in the U.S. that then became very competitive because of mill power, with power that came in, and put Manchester out of business. It's not a new issue. It's a very old issue. It's been solved in the past.
Mima, you have talked about how the private sector in Africa has really come into its own over the last 10, 20 years. Do you think that that's had a big difference in pushing added value?
We have seen the African private sector in the last 20 years, and especially last 10 years, become very, very sophisticated, very mature, real. So when you start doing the joint ventures, the JVs with African partners, there's a whole different story going on right now because both sides want to be competitive. And this is why I earlier said when we discussed legislation enabling the private sectors to grow, it's not just the foreign investment, it's also the domestic investment. So you begin with, you got the raw material that everyone wants. Absolutely number one factor. Number two is then the legislation that will say you must process here. Third part is now we add on there the environment and the infrastructure to make us competitive. And guess what? All of a sudden, there are real commercial deals.
So, Yofi, you have a president who is doing a lot about looking at adding value and really pushing this agenda. But for years, Africa didn't. And, this is part of the economic independence. What do you think changed?
Right after independence, most African countries had the central governments, running things, including businesses. And so it was easier, perhaps, to then just bring in the investment to extract and export. There wasn't a lot of private sector. Now, 30 years after, 40 years after, the narration is changing. And most economies are becoming more democratic and becoming liberal economies and enabling private sector growth. So that has become more important, and that conversation has now been escalated. And even more so with the advent of the AfCFTA, where there is a move to have a lot more trade between African countries than outside the continent, because the market is here, the resources are here. In Ghana, the fact that we are looking at the radical transformation of the economy from the export of raw materials and resources to value added also opens the door for private sector participation, both indigenous and external. We insist on adding value to our raw materials. We haven't gone yet the full haul of regulating against exporting raw materials, but I think gradually the whole continent is going to look at it that way. It must be fixed because all the raw materials are here, or all the market is here. What it requires are strategic partnerships and strategic investments that will enable us to build the infrastructure and build the industrial capacity to produce for ourselves and trade within ourselves. If we're able to do that, an additional 18 million jobs will be created on the continent, which will then put the continent much more even keel on political stability, because that is also very important. A lot of our presidents are becoming more aggressive in developing their countries and partnering with the local private sector to make that happen.
Professor Nkube, how much does legislating added value make the difference?
Yeah, I think that it will reduce growth volatility in Africa. I talked earlier about the quality of growth, that once the economy is diversified from a beneficiation strategy, then the growth becomes more stable, more predictable, and more durable. So that alone is a major step, because growth in Africa tends to be up and down, very bouncy and susceptible to shocks, all manner of shocks that we cannot absorb. The number two will create a stronger job base, so just create more jobs, even revenue correction, for example. I put in a beneficiation tax of 5%. It has always existed, by the way, but I suspended it for 2 years to give companies an opportunity to develop. But we have to be serious about beneficiation and make sure that everyone complies. We want to maximize value for the country and create jobs.
So what happens when countries start forcing the issue? Let's take the case of Gabon. The West African country has almost 90% forest cover. And after oil, logging was one of the biggest contributors to GDP. That is until 2010, when the government banned the exportation of logs. On the outskirts of Libreville in Gabon is a thriving economic zone, with more than 80 companies in wood processing, taking Gabon's natural resource of timber and manufacturing lumber, veneer, wood chips, and even furniture. Gabon is now the world's second largest producer of tropical plywood. Not every banned product will result in a flourishing industry with high employment rates for skilled labor and increases in GDP. It's complicated. It takes time and investment to develop, and often needs a local market to get the ball rolling. But what's possible? How can Africa use its leverage? And how big should Africa dream? So, Mima, creating value addition is not an easy process. What are the challenges involved?
Well, this is where I was discussing the question of value, the whole value chains. Do you need to go immediately to the final finished chocolate bar? Or should I be doing the liquid, the chocolate, maybe everything up to the packaging? Sending that chocolate to Switzerland and say, guys, you know what? At this point in time, you have better printing and packaging capability. You guys take that end of it. You package. But we'll do everything else. It's really finding that balance. So let's say, take it as far as what you have. And then that will literally stimulate the printing and packaging industry. Because it's not only chocolate that's printed and packaged, and it's all kinds of other food products. Now you have an aggregation of sort of requirements that drive in the industries. It's really finding that balance. You know, if you overdo it, you kill the goose. So let's go back to the cocoa example. We said 65% plus or minus Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, 35% elsewhere. If now production, local, meaning power and infrastructure, is a little more expensive than, let's say, Europe, but not that much more expensive, competitively priced, then I have every reason to produce as much of the value chain in Ghana. If, on the other hand, it is so high that I'm no longer anywhere near competitive, you know what? I'm going to go find those other 35% and start producing more over there. And that 35 will become 55.
But creating cluster industries is one a critical piece of architecture to maximize value from a beneficiation strategy. For example, let's think of let's say the leather sector, for example. What you could have is a company in one cluster that processes leather. Once the leather is processed, there's another company whose job is to cut into the right sizes of pieces, and then the next part is then to shape it cut it into the shape of a shoe, for example, different sizes. After that kind of treatment, and then the next company would then be manufacturing the rubber sole. The next company then will be putting things together. So for lithium, obviously the mine itself, and then the crushing plant, and then the concentrating plant, and then finally the refinery, and then finally the lithium battery manufacturing facility. So already that's a cluster industry. And in both these examples, we are working hard to create these cluster industries. It's just so efficient, especially if these companies are close together in one location.
Yeah, and Yofi, Ghana has a very strong economic zone. Tell us, what are the opportunities that you're talking to potential investors about?
We have recently come out with a 10-point industrialization plan, which includes an industrial and special economic zone in each of the 16 regions that we have, leveraging on the raw materials that exist in that region of the country. And so for all our minerals, particularly bauxite, iron ore, lithium, manganese, we are at gold, and even oil and gas. We are looking at a structure that enables easier investment and a better business environment. So more recently, I've spoken to quite a number of big players from different regions who are looking at coming in with industrial agriculture to add value to our raw materials and resources, because Ghana seems to have forged ahead in the production of processed fruit, particularly, and vegetables. So we're seeing quite a number of investors come in. And of course, I mean, mineral resources are always there. And for mineral resources, the investor comes whether the environment is good or bad, because they require the resources. But now we are seeing a lot of responsibility come into the sector. And we are seeing investors who are looking at strategic partnerships and relationships. and who can operate at the high end of the value chain as well. And so we are looking at that. And the important thing is government is working with the private sector in much more significant ways than it did before. And I think that is creating better paths to realizing the opportunities.
Professor Ncube, one of the things that I loved in the clip that we showed earlier of the African Development Bank President Adesina is that he doesn't stop at just creating the batteries, but he says, why not electric cars? So how big are you dreaming in all of this? What are your ideas for the future?
Yes, we're going in that direction. Once we're able to make the batteries, clearly we should be able to make cars. Again, in Zimbabwe has good skills in car assembly. We import knockdown kits and are able to put a car together and it gets on the road. So we believe that nascent base in terms of capacity to make cars, coupled then with the new lithium skills that we develop out of this process, we should be able to make an electric vehicle for ourselves, for Africa, and the rest of the world.
People have talked for years with Colton in DRC of creating batteries, creating cell phones in DRC closer to where Colton is brought out of the earth. And yet, what do you do in terms of risk when the places where a lot of these minerals are coming out of might be places where investors aren't always comfortable going in and investing?
I think sometimes, investors also exaggerate a risk. Really, when they should go onto the ground. For example, why is it easy for them to go in and extract? It takes a lot of investment to go underground and start digging up stuff and some mineral. They might as well invest in some form of manufacturing. So I'm also sure that it's a valid argument for them to argue that conflict is an issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question to ask because they are still investors in DRC. And so I don't see why not. I mean, why it cannot be extended there, unless, of course, it's more valuable just picking the resource than adding value.
Mima, you look at the Doing Business survey that the World Bank has put out. For years, there were a number of countries in Africa that were at the bottom. For you, Mima, you've invested all over in many places that the Doing Business survey said not to go to. Is risk a reason not to come and invest in added value?
Okay. I, for one, have never looked at it and do not look at it. I suspect most serious business people don't either. They're put together on some sort of good form, an algorithm that consultants have put together. Where do you go in and invest? You go in, first of all, where you have the raw materials that you want to work with. If I'm in agri-industry, I need whatever food products I'm in. I'm not going to do mangoes in Morocco. They don't grow in Morocco. I'm going to do mangoes in West Africa if I'm going to do mangoes. If it's minerals, it's the same thing. Now, so that's the first start. Second start, you will go in by saying, not where there's more or less risk, but where am I more or less capable of mitigating the risk? If I can mitigate it, it's like a no risk. So if I have the right government structures, the right ability through legislation, for example, could be to my advantage to mitigate that risk through partnerships with mature African partners, business partners, they can also help me steer the way. One doesn't look at a list and say, okay, that was number one. Now let me see on the map. Where is it? Okay, call the travel agent. Okay, well, how do I get there? No, that's not our business. Business starts with relationships, not on lists.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you so much to my guests, Mthuli Ncube, Minister of Finance in Zimbabwe, Yofi Grant, CEO of the Ghana Investment Promotion Center, and Mima Nedeljkovic, Chairman of Africa Global Schaefer. To our viewers in Africa, America, and around the world, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Carol Pinault, host and producer of Africa USA Now. Additional production by Kellen Cody, Alessandra Salase, and Alicia Gupta. Editing by Batsy Freddy. Africa USA Now is presented by the World Trade Center, Washington, D.C. You can find us on YouTube and your favorite podcast apps. Be sure to follow us and leave a review. Our production partners are Africa Global Schaefer and Pixie Corner. A special thanks to the African Development Bank and the Africa Investment Forum for their support. Africa's investment marketplace is championed by the African Development Bank and its partners to accelerate the closure of the continent's investment gaps. For more information on Africa USA Now, visit us at africausanow.com. We hope you've enjoyed the program and that you'll continue to tune in as we delve further into the intersection of Africa and the United States.